Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University, as well as the Director of the George Shepherd Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And throughout the year, we do a whole host of different programs, but the one that's often sort of most dear to me is what is known as Civil War Christmas. This is a student-led endeavor in which our undergraduate students create a series of programs, be it living history displays, walking tours, discussions about the Civil War era with different audiences, interactions with children. It's a really interesting and fun weekend. This year, due to the pandemic, that's not possible. And so what we decided to do in lieu of this tour is create a virtual house holiday tour. We're obviously positioned right in the heart of Shepherdstown here on German Street, thus the traffic running up and down. But what we'll do over the course of several different structures is give you just some sense of the rich architectural history of Shepherdstown, and several of the buildings at least are going to be sort of decked out for the holidays. And so we wanted to start here at what is known as the Conrad Shindler House, or what is today, of course, the George Shepherd Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. The structure itself dates to around 1796 and was at least designed by a vernacular architect known as Michael Folk. And what we've done is given you some sense of what holiday decorations may have looked like most likely in the 20th century. The big to-do that we have about Christmas today, which of course is wonderful, and I have 3 children and they enjoy it, as do I and my wife immensely, is really a phenomenon though that sort of comes into being very gradually over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. And so the decorations that I think we all love so much would have been seen in a very limited fashion throughout much of the 19th century, and probably towards the end of the Victorian era, we would have seen more of the proliferation of these type of holiday decorations. Nonetheless, we have before you some of the natural garland that you might see potentially in a house dating to the 19th century, potentially. And again, just giving you some sense of the holiday flavor, most certainly. And with that, what we're going to do is walk into the building, talk a little bit about some of the elements before we ultimately open it up to many of the other structures, which will be given for the spotlight. Now, one of the terms that you're going to hear quite often throughout the course of this tour, both for this structure and for the other ones that we're going to be looking at, is the hall and parlor design. Okay, hear that term quite a bit. And so quite fortunately, we have a rendering that was done by John C. Allen. Many of you know him from his book, Uncommon Vernacular, of what our structure may have looked like in the early 19th century. And what it features is that central hall and parlor design. My colleague and friend, Dr. Alexander, will be speaking in more detail about that when we go ultimately to the yellow house. But as you can see, our structure has been modified over time. The central hall, which was fashionable in the 18th and into the 19th centuries, eventually gives way to this more open design and this broad staircase, something that probably many of you are familiar with if you have a more modern kind of suburban home. But nonetheless, this hall parlor design, keep that in your mind, because again, you're going to hear that idea several times as we go through different structures over the course of this tour. Now, on a normal occasion, our building is open for researchers, for students, for programming and interpretation. Currently, though, it's closed due to university policy at both the local and state levels. And so we're going to probably restrict where we go today, but at least we wanted to give you some sense of the front hall parlor area, which we use today primarily for presentations, student workshops and labs, student groups and gatherings. But again, in a typical year, we have a very robust research library of some 3,000 secondary sources, as well as several drawers full of microfilm reels
that are part of the compiled service records, which ultimately detail a soldier's name, his regiment, some key demographic information that underpins our Civil War soldiers database. The soldiers that we have the most information on are those from West Virginia, of course, with some nods to the broader Potomac River Valley. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close. And again, although we're very sad that we can't do Civil War Christmas as we do in any given year, I'm sure we'll be back next year, but we are quite excited to bring to you a whole series of interesting homes that are either owned by the town, the university, or private citizens. And we're just going to give you some sense of the range of rich architectural history that you can find in quaint and historic Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And with that, thank you very much, and we'll close out for now.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We're in the heart right now of historic Shepherdstown, and you can get some sense just from the video of the historical integrity and the just incredible architectural fabric that we have in this community, which we like to showcase every year during our Civil War Christmas program, which of course is being presented to you virtually. A project that I've been incredibly interested in over the past year or so is the restoration, just the incredible rehabilitation of the Christian Clise House. And this structure dates to around 1789. And this incredible effort at restoration, rehabilitation has been spearheaded by the Slater family. And they've just done absolutely incredible work. Throughout the restoration process, you could gain some sense of the construction of the home, some of just the fabulous architectural detailing. And as you can see before us today, not only have they decorated it for the holiday season, but they have basically come to the very conclusion of this long and arduous process. And so I'm going to have Tim just give you some sense of the building's exterior before we pause and then move to the interior to feature some of the more prominent, interesting details in the home for you. So we have an incredibly rare opportunity here because of the graciousness of Austin and Carmen, and they are allowing us to go into their home, even though we are in the midst of a pandemic and thus we are wearing masks, but we will be cautious as we do so. And there are a number of elements in this house that are just absolutely striking. And so with that, Tim's going to follow behind me as we slowly make our way through this incredible building, which has a number of historical layers that we'll explore as we go on this tour. And so with that, we're going to head up the stairs. Making our way into what was most likely a early, perhaps 19th century addition to the main structure, which dates to, again, around 1789. So we're right now currently in what is the modern day dining room, but would have been the core of this 18th century house. And again, you can get some just sense of the incredible detail and restoration work that went into this building, and more importantly, sort of the modification of house form over time. As families expanded, they sought, any means really to continue to live in the same edifice, but again, expanding outward while changing some of the architectural elements to align with the new sensibilities. And so what we see, which we will explore both over at the Civil War Center and at the Yellow House later on, is this kind of classic central hall design flanked
by 2 parlors. And this is a form that really allows for a lot of functionality. And so as homes became increasingly spaces of domesticity, civility, and refinement, these central halls sort of partition off the more private domestic spaces from a more public arena. And this is an architectural form that has longer roots, but really begins to take shape over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. You might often hear this referred to as like a Georgian-style plan. And for purposes of houses today, it lends itself, of course, incredibly well to sort of the flow of the overall structure. And so with that, we're going to continue kind of walking through, carefully, to the second story. And watch your head coming up. And I think what's so fascinating about these homes is just how the forms are sort of layered on top of one another in ways that you wouldn't see necessarily with a modern house, but in ways that are just incredibly wonderful in these historic structures. And I thought it would be useful in particular to pause in this room. Not only does it have what's probably an early 19th century walking wheel, which is one of the ways in which primarily women, younger girls, would spin raw wool into threads. But we also have these exposed beams, which have been restored, but you can still get some sense of the adze work, those massive hand-hewn logs, type of detailing and construction that's only found in very specific instances in today's homes, as well as this sort of narrowing of fireplaces as we go up. The basement of this home, which we'll look at in a bit, has kind of a classic open hearth fireplace, which of course was done for all sorts of cooking, whereas when we move up through the edifices, we see the fireplaces narrow and they're designed primarily for heat. And that, of course, would be a necessity in an area like Shepherdstown for at least 8 or 9 months out of the year. Again, a very different sort of pace and rhythm of life than what we might think of today. Continue going through. And what was in the 19th and 20th centuries a sleeping porch has been transformed into this just absolutely wonderful study. Again, adaptive reuse. It's just so interesting to me. And we're going to make our way down what would have been a staircase utilized potentially by enslaved peoples, if not in the 19th and 20th centuries, by domestic workers. And the idea in these instances is the ability to sort of move without being visualized through the structure. So they're doing a lot of the kind of hard work. And so you often see these hidden staircases in structures from the 18th and 19th centuries. And be very careful coming down, Tim. It's quite narrow. I'm going to take a minute to orient you because that might have been a little dizzying. So if you think to my north, that's the front entrance, one room back and up. So we're now on the ground level of the structure in what is yet another addition, which has been transformed into this absolutely lovely kitchen. Again, giving you some sense of the exposed beams. There is the potential that this was at one point an external outbuilding that was incorporated into the main structure at some point over the course of the 19th century, though that's not entirely known to be exact, but that's a very common practice that you see throughout this region. Harewood, for instance, incorporates that design feature, and potentially even the Civil War Center has an addition that may have incorporated an external outbuilding. So again, making do with what's immediately at hand. And now coming back to near where we started. Now I'll allow Tim to get a picture here of some of the beautiful woodwork as well as the holiday decorations. And then finally, make note of the flooring, both those really beautiful wide boards. Once again, making the utmost use of space. We're going to go down and get another narrow stairway to what is the 18th and 19th century basements, depending upon the portion that we're in. In some ways, these are always my favorite spaces. Whenever we open up the Civil War Center and I have someone who loves buildings, I always take them down to our basement. This is where you can really see just the integrity of these structures and just the incredible elements, the size of these elements that go into supporting these edifices of the 18th and 19th centuries. Massive hand-hewn summer beams, massive hand-hewn beams, supporting the floor work. That open hearth fireplace, while modified at some point probably in the 20th century, you can get some sense of the scale. Once again, just an incredibly large beam providing that structural support. And interestingly, Austin related that there are some fragmentary primary sources from the 19th century that indicate this was a space in which the town council met, and this quite potentially may have been a tavern at one phase of the basement's life. As with many buildings here in Shepherdstown, quarried rock supporting the structure, and Austin has related from his research that most of the wood was actually harvested right on site. And so with that, we'll end where we started. And so we're now back in the heart of historic Shepherdstown. And again, we're just profoundly grateful to Austin and Carmen Slater for allowing us this just incredible opportunity. And we're extremely happy to bring to you the inside of the home and to showcase what is, I would say, just an absolutely impeccable restoration effort. So thank you very much. Well, hi, and welcome back, everyone. Again, I'm Dr. James Broomall, an Associate Professor of History here at Shepherd University, as well as the Director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And we will be masked today because we're going to be in close proximity as we work with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Keith Alexander, an Associate Professor of History, as well as the Director of our Historic Preservation Program that he works in conjunction with Dr. Julia Sandy. And it's our great pleasure to come today to what's often referred to as the Yellow House, but historically is known as the Catherine Weltzheimer House. And Keith's going to tell us a little bit about the history of the structure, what he and his students have been doing, as well as Dr. Sandy, to sort of publicize this history, and then where the structure is going to be going in the future. And so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague and friend, Dr. A.
Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today and to talk about certainly one of my favorite structures in town and really anywhere. This is the Catherine Weltzheimer House. It was built around 1817, which makes it certainly not the oldest house in town, but more than likely the oldest house on the campus of Shepherd University. Now, this is a 4-bay vernacular log house, 2-story. And what that means in layperson's terms, well, the 4 bays refers to these vertical openings here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 main openings, all right? And it is a log house, not a log cabin. When we go inside, you'll see that the logs are squared off rather than rounded. And that's the key difference between the log house and the log cabin. Log cabins were thrown up sort of in the middle of the wilderness to get people to survive as best they could. Log houses were squared off. They were usually sided, like this one with the German siding or the clapboard siding here, as fast as people could possibly afford to do so. And it is a vernacular house, meaning that it is based more on survival and based on function rather than trying to be fancy following a styled house. And so this house was purchased by Catherine Weltzheimer, we think around 1817. The lot records indicate that that's around the time that the house was constructed. And she occupied the house for a number of years, for about 6 years, until her daughter inherited it. And it remained in the Waltzheimer family until Shepherd University, Shepherd College then, acquired the property in about 1923. So Catherine Weltzheimer was a pub or a tavern owner here in Shepherdstown. And so this house itself has a really neat link to a lot of the women's history here in Shepherdstown. So let's go ahead and head on inside, and I'll show you more about what I was talking about in terms of the hall and parlor construction. All right, so now we're inside the Catherine Weltzheimer house, and hopefully you'll be able to see some of the things that I was talking about outside. For example, the squared off logs, the hall and parlor construction, as well as some indications of some of the past uses that we have here. So let me have you focus over here on the boards behind you here, and you see the squared off logs as well as the nogging here between the walls, between the logs, and you'll see that the inside is in a little bit rougher shape, but we are in the process of getting some money to turn this into a pretty exciting project, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. Now, there are some interesting kinds of ghosts, as I call them, here in the house that indicate not paranormal activity, but indicate real historical markers for things that were here in the past but that are no longer here. For example, we have a couple of boarded over openings here in the back. So that indicates that there was a rear attachment, and indeed there was up until about 1987 when that back part was removed. Another ghost here, and this may be hard to see with the camera, but you see here there is evidence on the floor of a partition here. And indeed, there was a partition that would have made this a hall and parlor structure. And the way that worked was that you entered into the main sort of utilitarian room over here, which was the hall, and you see the fireplace here, as well as the corner stair, also very typical of a hall and parlor construction. And then in this part of the house, which would have been behind another partition, would have been the places where people would have read, hung out, and so on. So food preparation would have been done in the hall, most of the living would have been done in the hall, and you would sort of retreat to the parlor to sit, to read, and so on. Nothing fancy, but that's an example of really how efficiently they used materials at the time, because this partition was quite narrow. The corner stair winds around the fireplace, making use of that space that would have otherwise been a very awkward space. And so the hall and parlor form is quite efficient. Now, it comes from Britain. It was a post-medieval British housing form that immigrants simply took over with them. Now, this house has seen a number of uses over the years. When Shepherd acquired it in about 1926, it was used for housing. It's been used for sorority meetings. In fact, the beautiful black fence here, the railing was dedicated and donated by the Phi Sigma Chi sorority. That had meetings here in the Yellow House. There was also the home economics department here at Shepherd. And then it became used as storage for archaeological equipment. Well, the house began to be demolished by neglect. And so a number of years ago, about 10 years ago now, we got a grant from the State Historic Preservation Office to do some major restoration. And so we were able to solidify things, really stabilize the structure. And now it's becoming part of a new focus on campus, and that is a historic preservation laboratory. And so we've already had a couple of windows workshops here. And then just 2 years ago, my colleague Dr. Julia Sandy and I received a generous grant from the WISH Foundation, that's Women Investing in Shepherd. And that was a $28,000 grant that has paid for additional windows restoration, as well as being paid for going towards some interpretive signage. Now, a lot of the public programming that was involved in that grant unfortunately has had to be postponed due to COVID. But with new vaccines coming online, with new sort of a light at the end of the tunnel here, I think we can look forward to the Waltzheimer House really coming back to shine again and becoming the home of some pretty neat interpretive programs. So some of the cool features of this structure are the squared off logs here. Then you have the plaster that is filled in over the nogging, and over here you can see the nogging or chinking itself, and you can see that they pretty much used whatever they could get their hands on. There are stones in here, there are pieces of wood, there is mud plaster, and so on. And it's kind of cool too, because if you look carefully, you can see some of the old markings used by the old, or made by the old tools that they were using. Here, for example, and then up on some of these boards here, I know there's a whole bunch up here, some of the markings, all right? And then over time, you can see that they have shored up these posts because of the water damage and so on, in a technique called sistering. So the hope is that we will be able to illustrate some of these preservation technology techniques and terms using the Yellow House as an example. Now, let's see. There's obviously been some significant water damage here, and the boards underneath here have been replaced, and you can see pretty clearly the differentiation between the old boards and the new boards. The other neat thing that we're going to do is that we are set to restore this old fireplace here, and you can see that that's where the wood stove chimney would have gone into, the stovepipe. And so the hope is to be able to use the structure as a way of teaching students how to read a building like this, and so how to interpret some of the evidence that is left behind that hasn't ended up in books, but that remains behind for us to analyze. So as I'd mentioned, the plans for these houses was typically to cover over the boards as soon as possible, and that was true on the outside as well as the inside. And so here you see how that was done with these furring strips. And so what would happen was that they would nail drywall or plaster or what have you over top of this and use this as the base. And so you've got these lovely sturdy logs concealed oftentimes behind the interior plaster on lath, or sometimes later on drywall. And so you can see some pretty neat hardware fixtures as well here, and just a whole story of the various layers of use here. And I love to use the term a palimpsest, and so buildings are palimpsests. Each successive user of that building leaves behind evidence of that use in a palimpsest, which is a kind of parchment that's been used over and over and over again. So a building like this can tell multiple stories over time.